The road to recovery is a long and difficult journey. For one Bluffton man, it took more than 20 years. Tori Simkovic has his story.
After decades of drug abuse, Brian Cassio never thought he'd be clean. The father of four grew up in New Orleans, and that's where his struggle with addiction began.
My father died when I was 4 years old, and that was the beginning of me thinking there wasn't a God. My mom got remarried when I was 5 years old, and my father was an alcoholic and abusive, my stepfather.
In 1994, Brian Cassio's brother Troy died of a heroin overdose. A few years later, Cassio began using Vicodin with another brother.
One day I couldn't find any Vicodins on the streets, and someone offered me heroin. I would get the same amount of heroin from the same dealer every day.
But one day in the late 90s, he says it looked different.
By the time I was pulling a syringe out my arm, my body was like, on the inside was vibrating. You couldn't see visible, like my hands weren't shaking, but I could feel it. And then it was kind of like the Looney Tunes commercial. My peripheral vision just shut out.
He was revived by Narcan and woke up in an ambulance.
My first thought wasn't, thank God I'm alive. My first thought was, why did you bring me back to this? All the shame, guilt, pain, remorse, desperation, isolation, everything was there again.
In 2000, he moved to Bluffton, South Carolina to try and get clean.
And in 2003, I broke my back, and the doctors were giving me medications that I could use a syringe with.
The medication meant to ease his pain fueled his addiction.
September 19, 2013, DEA and Bluffton Police Department surrounded my house.
As he sat in jail, his wife sent him a letter.
And it says that, I love you, I'll hold your hand through everything. But I filed for divorce. I felt like I can't do this any longer, that I'm tired of fighting this fight. And from that morning, life has been different.
He joined a 12-step program and went to 2 or 3 meetings a day.
In the beginning of recovery, I was so full of shame and guilt. Like many times at rehab, I cried.
He later reconnected with his 4 children, and he recalls a conversation with his daughter in New Orleans when he first got clean.
And all she said was, you stopped calling like you didn't love me anymore. I needed to try and explain to a 16-year-old. I never stopped loving her. I was incapable of showing love because of my disease.
He cries when he tells his story, with remorse for past behavior and gratitude for his new chance in life.
I'm not sitting in prison. I was facing 20 years in prison. Me and my wife still together. I'm not divorced. The reason I do these stories right here is to try and give that addict that's out there watching some hope.
Next week marks 4 years clean. Cassio now works for a 12-step program on Hilton Head Island, leading through example that recovery can work. In the studio, I'm Tori Simkovic.